Regrettable transmigration. The Empire of Noxus is a powerful empire with a fearsome reputation. To those beyond its borders, Noxus is brutal, expansionist, and threatening, yet those who look beyond its warlike exterior see an unusually inclusive society, where the strengths and talents of its people are respected and cultivated. The Empire of Noxus was founded by its first and sole emperor, the Immortal Emperor, who was born in the Valyrian Freehold and rose from the position of ordinary adventurer to the lofty position of emperor of the entire nation. It wasn't known when exactly the establishment of the Noxus first began, but it is known that several years before the doom of the Valyrian, the Immortal Emperor led several of his people to establish the first settlement on the continent of Valoran, north of the continent of Essos. Over the years, some discontent elements of the Valyria secretly left the Freehold to establish a new nation, with even prominent members of the Dragonlord families. Only when it was too late did the lofty and arrogant Dragonlords realize that many of their legacies and people actually left their jurisdiction, and before war could erupt between the dragons, the doom destroyed the fabled Valyrian Freehold, until nothing than just ashes remained from pristine glory of the Dragonlords and most powerful extraordinary nation in the world. After the fall of the most destructive war in the past 5 centuries in Westeros, which resulted in the almost mutual destruction of the royal house of Targaryen, the Church of the Seven and Parthenon of the Old Gods, and many others, the Empire of Noxus remains probably the single entity in the world that commanded the power of the most dangerous extraordinary creatures in the known world, the dragons. Archmaester Marwyn, Saint of the Citadel Order, year 285 AC of Westerosi calendar. Outskirts of the Valyrian Freehold, somewhere in the Painted Mountains. Damn, there is no end to them, fucking goblins. A young man stated as he swung his sword and severed the head of one of the ugly creatures that was crawling on the ground. The man was young-looking, with silver hair and bright purple eyes, wearing leather armor and armed with nothing more than a sword. And they say that upon transmigration, you get the boons or cheat. What an utter rubbish. He transmigrated a few years ago, and there were several things that he noticed that didn't give him sleep at night and were practically equally disturbing in a certain sense. The first thing he realized upon his transmigration was that he was in the Valyrian Freehold. That meant that he was in the world of the ASOIAF, though the other discoveries essentially stopped those thoughts when he learned of the existence of the Beyonders. Beyonders are sentient beings who have consumed Beyonder characteristics, allowing them to advance to higher sequences in a pathway. The most common method of advancement is through consuming potions made of Beyonder characteristics and other supplementary materials. There are multiple pathways for Beyonders to take, all starting from sequence 7. Beyonders gain power from these specific potions but have to endure the side effects, paranoia, hallucinations, etc. that ensue upon consuming them. There is a chance they will succumb to the side effects and lose control, becoming monsters themselves. This sounded really like the novel Lord of the Mysteries. Instead of the 9 sequences, there were only 7 of them, and even the pathways were vastly different from what he remembered from the novel. This was proof that his meta-knowledge wasn't that much reliable either. And probably the last thing that was annoying him to no end were the circumstances of his birth. He was born to one of the 40 Lord Freeholders of the Valyrian Freehold, Dramath Tenebranes. Unfortunately for him, his birth father was killed not long after he was born by a saint from the House of Black and White, which was worshipping the many-faced god and was very against practiced slavery, something in which the Valyrians as a slaving civilization reveled. In the end, after the death of the Lord Tenebranes, who was the sole saint in the entire Tenebranes family, the vultures didn't wait long before they could show their fangs, and soon enough, those who had grudges against his family made a move, and in the end, the entire Tenebranes family was broken apart one by one. He managed to survive, perhaps by a stroke of sheer luck, when he was smuggled from the capital by a few of the remaining loyal servants of the Tenebranes family. Coupled with the fact that he was the bastard son and his birth wasn't in the records of the House Tenebranes, essentially, nobody really searched for him that night. From there on, he lived on the outskirts of the Valyrian Freehold, essentially living as an adventurer and doing what he could to make a living. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. When he was 15, Valkorion managed to become a Beyonder, by consuming warrior potion of the Crimson Moon pathway and thus started hunting weak monsters that were living around here. Not only would he occasionally find some ingredients that were required for the Beyonder potions, but many parts of the goblins and other monsters could be sold for a nice sum of money. Not to mention, there was another thing that was looming over his head, which was the most probably, inevitable doom of the Valyria. In truth, He didn't know if it would happen the same way it happened in the ASOIAF canon, but something was telling him that it would indeed happen and everything would go to shit. Apparently, he was only a few years from the doom, as it was currently apparently only a few years before the Targaryens would move out of Valyria. Even here on the outskirts of the Freehold, he heard the rumors that apparently the daughter of the lord of the Targaryen family went mad when she spouted nonsense about inevitable doom. Which was rather ironic instead. They lived in an extraordinary world, and yet nobody really believed her dreams. Valkorion knew that the main reason for that was probably the infinite arrogance of most of the Dragonlord families and even the Church of the Dragon Gods. In the end, they were the most powerful faction in the known world, eclipsing the power of the Golden Empire of Yti or the Shadowlands of Ashai. There were not many Beyonder organizations that could dream to even match the might of the Valyrian Freehold with the sheer number of Beyonders and dragons that the Freehold commanded. So, it seemed that even in this world, the wonders of Valyria would be lost to time and once again due to the arrogance of man. Not like it was his concern anyway. Valkorion decided to remain in the Valyria as much as possible to gather resources and some of its heritage, before everything would go to fuck somehow. He would be stupid to leave now. In the end, it was the most developed civilization in the world. From what he heard, in the Westeros, Beyonders were rare, to the point where the general population was unaware of their existence, as it was some kind of pact between the Church of the Seven main noble families and Parthenon of the old gods. That was also the reason why the Valyrians avoided the place like a plague. After learning that there was nothing notable there, they basically quickly forgot about Westeros, and it wasn't really a point of interest aside from ordinary trade and so on. Just a few more, and I would have enough to return. After taking everything of value from the goblins, Valkorion scanned his surroundings before dedicating himself to dwelling deeper into the Paintain Mountains. The things that he gathered till now would most probably fetch him only a few tens of golden dragon coins. He would need at least a few hundred so he could buy a new sword made from Valyrian steel, because the one that he was using wasn't really suitable for the Beyonders, even that of the lowest sequence. So, thoughts, anyone? Hopefully, this fanfic will become the second Holy Chronicles of Badr in terms of size, and it will be vastly better in quality compared to the HCB. For some time, I wanted to write a fanfic where MC started in ancient Valyria. One of the greatest motivators lately to write something like this, mainly to play with my idea of Valyrian MC, came after reading A Song of Ice and Fire, House Baelaren by Jason Eric, a great fanfic by the way, go and check it out. And recently, I have been reading several LOTM fanfics, so I have decided to integrate the Beyonder system into the world of ASOIAF, though there would be some elements of other franchises mixed in. Trafford Creators Thoughts. 12 comments, 0 vote. No cheat, only hard work. Valyrian Freehold was a great territory that spanned much of the continent of Essos, stretching from the Valyrian Peninsula to the shores of the Essos and reaching even the Blackwater Bay of the Westeros. It encompassed most of the eastern continent and reached every single free city, island, and place known and unknown. Even though it was never an empire due to its specific nature, its power and prestige eclipsed most of the empires in the known world. It was common knowledge that ancient Valyria was a civilization of humble shepherds who discovered dragons in the 14 Flames, a ring of volcanoes on the Valyrian Peninsula. Valyrian stories claim that dragons originated in their lands, although tales from Ashai claim the beasts were brought to Valyria from the Shadowlands. Church of the Dragon God claimed that it was their god who bestowed the Valyrian shepherds the extraordinary powers of the Beyonder pathway and allowed them to obtain magic and tame the dragons. Meanwhile, the Beyonders of Ashai, under the leadership of Shadowbinder Order, were claiming that it was they who gave the Valyrians the means to tame the dragons in the name of their god. In the end, the theological thesis didn't really matter much, as the result was more important in this aspect. The Valyrians tamed the dragons with their newfound powers, mastered the techniques of the extraordinary pathways, bred and raised their dragons as devastating weapons of war, and created the first extraordinary civilization in the Third Epoch. After walking for several hours in the hostile environment of the Painted Mountains, Valkorion finally found a nice cave, where he would remain during the night before going a bit deeper into the mountains. The Painted Mountains were always a problem for the Freehold, because it was swarming with the goblinoids. There were countless goblins, hobgoblins, bugbears, and other goblinoid species living in the Painted Mountains, which made the place rather dangerous. Not only that, but when they were overpopulated, they would often go down from the mountain range and raid the surrounding towns and villages for resources and mainly food. Due to that, the Freehold was investing a lot in regularly cleaning the Painted Mountain range, and thus, many adventurers, poor fellows, or just people in dire need of money went into the Painted Mountain range and killed the creatures there. With this tempo, it would take a few months before the potion is fully digested. Hopefully, I would be able to gather enough money for formula and ingredients. Making a small fire, he started roasting meat from some deer that he had hunted down half an hour prior as he pondered over the matter. In a certain sense, he was rather lucky because due to his foreknowledge, even though it wasn't 100% reliable as this word was vastly different due to differences in pathway, he knew very well how the Beyonders worked and was aware of some things. For example, one of the more valuable ones was the acting method. The acting method is the process of acting according to the potion's name in order to fully digest the Beyonder potion. With the acting method, Beyonders learn some facts about their potion. Even among the Beyonder en masse, the acting method wasn't widely known, and most ordinary Beyonders who were not from large organizations, churches, or extraordinary families were not aware of its existence and purpose. Fortunately, he was, which made his life easier, at least something. There are still a few hours until the evening. I should go train a bit. In the end, Valkorion spent the remaining hours training with his sword in the Juyo sword form. Juyo was described as the most vicious form of sword combat and was said to be filled with both fury and malignant grace. The form was given the title of the most difficult and demanding form in all of the sword combat that was ever created in the Valyrian Freehold. This was all part of his acting method as a warrior. Not only did he need to constantly fight against enemies and beat them in single combat, but he also needed to train in the various forms of martial arts and with weapons. With each season that he spent training or fighting, he was getting better and better. That was the influence of the combat proficiency of the warrior Beyonder characteristic. If he had to tell, right now, after becoming Beyonder, he was several times stronger than the ordinary human of his old world. Not only that, he was still getting stronger because the potion wasn't fully digested. Even right now, he could lift around 600 kilograms without many problems, and his endurance was equally staggering. This continued for several hours, after which he had his dinner and laid down to have some sleep while pondering over the shitty transmigration as he was angry at the very concept of fate right now. I should be making some preparations for the doom. The easiest way would be to grow my own power base and gather resources, especially some dragon eggs. In the end, being able to be bound to dragon is in my very own blood. Obtaining as much as possible from the heritage of the Valyrian Freehold was at the top of his list if the doom ever happened. On the contrary, with the apparent existence of gods and powerful Beyonders, if the doom still happened, then he seriously doubted that it would be due to just the explosion of the 14 flames. As paranoid as he was, he knew that there was some conspiracy in play, but that was already far away from him right now. On the next morning, Valkorion moved forward because staying in one place was like seeking death in the Painted Mountains. Even though most of the goblinoids were not the most powerful extraordinary creatures around, they were making up for their individual weakness with their sheer numbers. In the books he read, there were even cases where even mid-sequence Beyonder dragon riders were overrun with almost inexhaustible numbers of enemies. Of course, such cases were exceedingly rare and almost never happened, but there were some occasions when they happened. So, he was rather wary of such a situation and put his cautiousness to the max. Still, searching for the goblins in this damned place wasn't that hard because the entire Painted Mountains were just swarming with them. It seems that they are once again close to the overpopulation. Valkorion thought when he noticed traces of many goblinoids that were here and there, as it seemed that the overpopulation of their damned species seemed to be once again happening. When it came to such a scenario, Valyrian Freehold would usually declare an extermination crusade on the regions where the extraordinary creatures were overpopulated so they could cull the population to manageable limits. It would be usually led by dragonlords and supported by the Valyrian armies and armies of their vassals. However, it was also a very good opportunity for the adventurers and other freelancers who wanted to make some money from the entire ordeal. On Patreon, there are already 5 chapters ahead of the current release rate. Support me on the Patreon for the future releases. URL. Trafford Creators Thoughts. 6 comments 0 vote. Plenty of loot. It didn't take him long to find another group of goblins, and this time, as he saw it, he was in luck because there were several of them, and it seemed that they were transporting some goods with them. Ordinary goblins stoop between 1 meter tall to maximally 1, 2 meters tall and withered, something between 18 kilograms to 25 kilograms on average. They had flat faces, sloped back foreheads, broad noses, pointed ears, and small, sharp fangs, and their eyes varied in color from red to yellow. Their skin color ranged from yellow through any shade of orange to a deep red, though they also came in shades of green. All members of the same tribe normally share the same skin color. Goblins typically dressed in dark leathers soiled by poor hygiene and colored in a similar range of tones to their skin. There are around 9 of them, rather relaxed or just unruly. It is always pretty hard to tell what is going on in the heads of the goblins. He observed the goblins from a distance for some time because he already had some experience with the creatures as he was hunting them even before he became Beander. Right now, hunting goblins was probably his sole source of income, as many of their body parts were rather precious. If he was lucky, he could obtain some of their extraordinary cores, which were equal to the Beander characteristics. But they were very, very rare, and till now, he managed to obtain only one when he killed a severely injured goblin chief after he came across an almost destroyed goblin tribe. One of the extraordinary cores sold for several hundred golden dragons, and for the money, he was able to buy all the ingredients for the Beander potion for the Sequence 7 warrior. As he saw the 9 goblins carrying several bags of things with them, he followed after them, sneaking past rocks and hiding behind the terrain until the goblins decided to rest for some time, for whatever reason, which was his time to act. He strongly gripped his sword as he rushed towards the goblins that were putting all of their loot in one place and stabbed one of the goblins from behind. Other goblins reacted almost immediately when they saw that one of theirs was killed and attacked the Valyrian human with newfound ferocity. The hatred between the Valyrians and goblinoids of the Paintain Mountains was deeply seated. Like other goblinoids, goblins often had a short temper, and were more easily provoked than individuals of most other races. Goblins, especially among the goblinoids, were known to be especially stupid and greedy. They were extremely easily angered and acted purely on emotion. Using the Juyo style against the goblins was proving to be especially effective, because with the strong, powerful and fast attacks, the goblins were soon enough decimated. As the weakest species among the goblinoids, they were not particularly powerful because even regular people could beat them. Average goblins were not really that powerful, and it required the ordinary trained soldier to beat a few of them, as their physical prowess wasn't really great. For Beanders, the goblins were basically the easiest prey, though some of the goblins, especially the goblin shamans or chieftains of tribes, were a match for Sequence 7 Beanders, and sometimes they were even stronger than the Sequence 7 Beander, depending on the pathway of the Beander. As the last head of the goblin rolled on the ground, Valkorion swung his sword as he got rid of the blood from the sword, before he returned the sword back to the sheath. Now that the goblins were dead, he felt that the digestion rate of his warrior potion was speeding up a little bit, which was to be expected as it was the result of the last fight, as that was the best acting method for the warrior. After every goblin was dead, he started going through the things that the goblins were attempting to transport because seeing 9 goblins carrying something was rather a rare sight. Unfortunately for Valkorion, most of the things that goblins were carrying were just trash, some random things that they picked up after the battle, most probably after they ambushed some travelers or unlucky adventurers. On the bright side, he managed to gather something around 200 golden dragons from the bags and some pieces of jewelry, several rings, necklaces, and armbands that could be sold for a nice sum of money. It was very well known that the goblins were famous for collecting shiny things, even though they were more often unaware of the real value of the things that they were collecting. After he went through the goblin loot, another thing were the corpses of the goblins. As the extraordinary creatures, several parts of their bodies were rather valuable, enough to fetch him several tens of golden dragon coins from one corpse. The most valuable body parts was the heart, ears and eyes. As he was butchering through the corpses of the goblins, he was mildly disappointed that there was no extraordinary core, but that was to be expected, as this goblin group consisted of rather young and weak goblins, so none of them would have something like extraordinary core. When everything was finished, he put all of the things into the bags that he prepared for the Beodner ingredients and also put away all the valuables. Noticing the amount of loot that he gained from this trip into the Painted Mountain, it was time to return back to the nearest town and cash out the resources. Careries was a city located down to the Painted Mountains and served as the first line of defense against the goblinoids living in the Painted Mountains or the Dothraki Commissars that attempted to attack the Freehold in case of their madness. It was more of a fortress than of a city, and the population was just in a few tens of thousands, most of them were just soldiers of the Freehold army, adventurers, and, of course, many slaves that were living in the Careries. Often shipped directly from the cities of Astapor, Marine or Yunkai of the Slaver Bay. It looked like a typical Valyrian city. Most of the buildings were in the grandiose architectural style with plenty of reminiscent of the dragons. Of course, the most notable feature was the fabled black walls made with the Valyrian techniques, which were considered impenetrable and indestructible. As he approached the gates of the fortress city, he was stopped by the guards that were clad in the Valyrian steel armor from toe to head, as they were elite members of the Freehold legions. When he gave them his adventurer card that served as verification of his identity, they let him pass. It was rather interesting because the Valyrian Freehold was rather advanced, much more than the nations of the known world that he remembered from the books of the ASOIAF. On Patreon, there are already 20+ chapters ahead of the current release rate. Support me on the Patreon for the future releases. URL: Trafford Creators Thoughts. 5 comments 0 vote. Pissed. Download the app for additional rewards. More events, more perks. Winning you more free perks. Download now. Trafford. Download app now. Careries. In terms of appearance, Valkorion was rather standing out among the other Valyrians because of his ashen white hair compared to the silver, golden, or platinum of the pure-blooded Valyrians. But most importantly, he had molten golden-colored eyes, which were rather unusual among the Valyrians because all of the pure-blooded Valyrians had purple-colored eyes. Valkorion knew that he wasn't a pure-blooded Valyrian, but rather a hybrid between the Valyrian and something else. Apparently, his mother was from a different continent and wasn't native to Valyria, less saying about her more unfortunate status as a foreigner, which was something that the Valyrians were not really fond of. The members of the Dragonlord families and Lord Freeholders especially looked down on anyone who wasn't pure-blooded Valyrian. Even among the average Valyrian nobility that were not part of the 40 Dragonlord families, this sentiment was rather standard. Due to that, he was often looked down on by more strict Valyrian nobles and members of the 40 Dragonlord families, but he didn't really care much about such things. Not to mention, he was aware that in a few years, everyone would be dead, and he would still live. As he returned back to the Careries, he felt some sense of ease because this was a place where he had been living for the past 18 years, and it was his home. The streets were full of people, everyone was doing something, and most of the people that were living in the Careries were just ordinary commoners. For the nobility of the Freehold, this place was too far from the capital, Valyria, and it wasn't worth it for them to live there. Aside from a few that were basically stationed here, mostly several dragon riders that were tasked with the protection of the borders and threats of the Painted Mountains. He knew that the Careries was the official hold of the House Valyries, which was one of the top houses of the Valyrian Freehold. Even though, officially, all families of the Dragonlord families were equal to each other, there were some that were more equal than others. Of course, the Triarch of the Valyrian Freehold were on the top of the food chain, even among the Dragonlord families, and the House Valyries was one of the Triarchs for several centuries, probably more than 1 millennia, and yet, they still maintained their status and strength for 1,000 years. Valkorion also knew that they were one of the true angel families of the Valyrian Freehold that had angel watching over them, which was giving them special status, as not many of the 40 Dragonlord families had angel among them. Most of them had just saint, and some weaker, or those at the end of the tail, had just sequence 3b under maximally. Tenebrae's family wasn't the strongest out of the families, but from what Valkorion managed to gather, it had he found out that the Tenebrae's was a rather respected and powerful family, with several dragon riders under their commands, and there were rumors that the Patriarch was close to advancing to the Anglehood. In the Valyrian Freehold, where the knowledge of the Beyonders and extraordinary powers was rather common and public, it wasn't that hard to find such information. So, it was rather bugging him how it could fall overnight. Nevertheless, he quickly banished all negative thoughts as he advanced toward the branch of the Adventurer Guild to submit the mission that he had completed. He managed to annihilate several tens of goblins and sell the resources. The building of the Adventurer Guild was in the middle of the Careries, and because the Careries wasn't really a big city, Valkorion quickly arrived at the Adventurer Guild. Contrary to other buildings in the city, it looked rather modest, yet still made from the finest stone and materials that could be found across the Freehold. In the first place, there were not many people present, as most of the adventurers were completing missions in the Painted Mountains, resting after missions, or just laying dead somewhere after being killed by some extraordinary creatures or other adventurers. Good morning, my lord. How can the Adventurer Guild assist you today? The woman behind the counter asked as he looked at the mark on her face, signaling that she was a slave, branded by one of the slave circles that operated within the freehold and sold slaves. Redeem reward for the hunt of the goblins and selling some of the extraordinary materials. After he stated his request, he started pulling out the things that he had gathered from the goblins. Most of the ingredients were nicely preserved. After a quick count from the receptionist, he was given around 100 golden dragon coins for the ingredients and mission reward. It wasn't a lot, but it was still a nice amount of money for some lowly goblins and extraordinary ingredients from their corpses. After collecting the money, another stop in his journey was the marker, where he wanted to sell the jewelry that he had obtained. That was the truly valuable thing. Contrary to the previous quiet and silent adventurer guild, this was an entirely different world. The marketplace was set within the cobblestone streets of a southern Careries district, surrounded by stone and timber buildings, their thatched roofs and wooden beams casting long shadows as the sun reached its zenith. Stalls and booths lined the streets, each manned by a wide array of vendors, ranging from Valyrians, Giscari, nobles, and commoners alike. Some people from the far golden empire of Yt and Valkorion saw there even a few people who seemed to be beyonders from the Ashai. The air was filled with the melodic sounds of minstrels playing lutes and flutes, the clinking of metal as blacksmiths displayed their wares, and the boisterous calls of merchants hawking their goods. Colorful banners and canopies hang above the stalls, fluttering in the gentle breeze. The smell of freshly baked bread, roasting meats, and exotic spices wafts through the air, mingling with the earthy scent of straw and the occasional whiff of incense from a nearby apothecary's tent. The market offered a cornucopia of goods, handcrafted jewelry, finely wrought weapons, enchanted trinkets, and rare magical ingredients. Farmers were selling their products, from bushels of apples and sacks of grain to baskets of vibrant vegetables and fragrant herbs. He ignored most of the stalls and people, heading towards one particular store that was in a small building, where he was selling most of his more precious loot or things that he obtained from his adventuring. It was managed by the clan Pharaohs, one of the mercantile clans of the Valyrian Freehold. They were a rather peculiar bunch of people. Clan Pharaohs was one of the oldest mercantile clans in the entire Essos, as well as one of the most powerful. They were not really nobles of the Valyrian Freehold, in fact, but they were richer than most of the Valyrian nobles, and their power was not weaker than some of the Dragonlord families that were ranked at the bottom of the Dragonlord families. Even in the world of the Beyonders, money was a very strong motivator for most. On Patreon, there are already 10+ chapters ahead of the current release rate. Support me on the Patreon for the future releases. URL: Trafford Creators Thoughts. 3 comments 0 vote. Clan Pharaohs and money. Clan Pharaohs traced their history back to the Rhoynish Wars between the Valyrian Freehold and Rhoynar. The Rhoynish Wars were a series of wars fought between the city-states of the Rhoynar and colonies of the Valyrian Freehold. Rhoyne was rather a powerful nation that worshipped Mother Goddess, and there were plenty of powerful Beyonders within the country. As the Valyrian Freehold was expanding its influence, only the Rhoyne had the power to confront the mighty Valyrian Freehold head-on. In the end, not even their power was enough to overcome the might of the Valyrian Freehold, but they were able to do some serious damage to the Freehold. During one of the last battles between the two foes, which lasted for entire centuries, Prince Garin of Creautres gathered support from several orthodox and secret organizations to combat the Valyrians, their dragons, armies and Beyonders. Prince Garin himself was fabled to be one of the most powerful angels of that age and was able to kill one of the members of the Triarchy of the Freehold. It was his ultimate end, as he was able to take one of their greatest foes with them. In the end, Rhoyne was defeated, the temple of Mother Goddess crumbled apart. Some of the Valyrian scholars and maesters of the Maester Order speculated that the loss of the Rhoyne was due to the fall of the Mother Goddess. In response, Princess Nymeria, the ruler of Ny-Sar, quickly led her people out of Essos using whatever ships and barges they could find. The story of their flight became known as the 10,000 ships. Their refugee fleet wandered the lands of the Summer Sea for many years before eventually arriving in Dorne, the desert land in southern Westeros. In Westeros, they eventually merged with another powerful Beyonder family, creating what was now known as House Nymeros Martell. Which, on a side note, is ruling the kingdom of Dorne to this day. Oh, Sir Nerona, welcome back again. When he entered the store owned by the clan Pharaohs, he was greeted by a man who looked to be in his 30s. He had short black hair and a mustache, wearing round glasses and very luxurious clothing that was putting to shame even some of the most extravagant Valyrian nobles. His surname, Nerona, was left by his mother because he couldn't really use the surname of his father for several reasons, not like he really wished to even. Not to mention, it was far safer to use the surname of his mother, as she was unknown to all but him. You can drop the act, Albus, we are not in one of your galas or under the watch of your cousin. Valkorion said as the man sighed a bit, looking visibly more relaxed than previously. So, what have you brought to little me this time? I hope something precious. Albus Pharaohs was one of the direct descendants of the clan Pharaohs and was a rather high-ranked member. Contrary to others in his generation, he decided to take control of the family business in the border region, which was mainly dealing with extraordinary ingredients, sealed artifacts, and other things from dangerous zones such as the Painted Mountains. He had been staying in the Careries for the past year or so because of the incoming overpopulation of the goblinoids in the Painted Mountains, which was a very precious business opportunity for the clan Pharaohs. Some pieces of jewelry from the goblins. He then put everything on the table, and Albus Pharaohs started inspecting the pieces of jewelry. Valkorion could swear that he saw imaginary signs of money in his eyes. Interesting. This little thing here is made from imperial gold, a rather very rare extraordinary metal, a very precious. Where the hell could have a bunch of goblins find such a precious armband is really beyond me. Valkorion was just observing how Albus Pharaohs was gushing over the pieces of jewelry that he found from the goblins while he himself was now thinking about where the goblins obtained such a thing. While he wasn't the most educated person around in this new world, he still knew that the imperial gold was a very precious material. There were only a few veins of the imperial gold in the known world, one of them was controlled by the House Lannister of the Westerlands, and they guarded it with strong jealousy. And some could be said about the mine that was located in the Golden Empire of Yt, so it wasn't really easy to obtain even a kilogram of the imperial gold without paying a ridiculous price for the material. I am quite certain that we can auction it, and it should fetch minimally several thousand golden dragon coins, or perhaps that if you have another requirement, we can put them forward instead of money. Hearing what the high-ranking member of the clan Pharaohs said, he was intrigued by this because this could be a good opportunity to obtain the Beander potion recipe and ingredients much faster than he initially anticipated. He, himself, didn't have much connection, but if it was auctioned by the clan Pharaohs, it would attract many powerful individuals who were wealthy and powerful enough to provide the things that he needed. It would be good to obtain the Beander potion recipe for the Sequence 6 Beast Tamer of the Warrior Pathway, together with the complete set of ingredients. If we put such a request, how many gold dragon coins would it fetch? As he pondered over the matter, he asked Albus Pharaohs, who finished the examination of all things that Valkorion brought to the shop. Generally speaking, potion recipe for Sequence 6 Beander potion is worth around 1,000 or so golden dragon coins, yet this piece of work has a monetary worth of something between 5,000 golden dragon coins to 6,500 golden dragon coins. That was indeed a lot more than he expected, so right now, Valkorion was stunned when he heard the number. If we obtain the potion recipe and one set of ingredients, then it would still be around 4,500 golden dragon coins, minus 10% of the value of the golden dragon coins as a fee for our services. That would be leaving you with the approximate number of 4,000 golden dragon coins. Still, the final sum would depend on the result of the auction. For that, I would like to auction this in the capital of Mother Valyria. I am quite certain that this piece of art would attract the attention of some wealthy dragonlords. That was certainly a lot of money, especially for someone like him, who wasn't really very rich, and every single piece of coin he needed to earn with his sweat and blood. Then do it that way. And what of the rest of the things? Valkorion agreed to the proposal of Albus Pharaohs, and they then went over the rest of the jewelry. Though there wasn't much, most of the things were ordinary, and their collective value was something around 500 golden dragon coins. Still, even that was a tremendous sum of money for common people and even to some lesser nobles, but for the Beyonders, especially powerful ones, it was just a small amount. On Patreon, there are already 20+ chapters ahead of the current release rate. Support me on the Patreon for the future releases. URL: Trafford Creators Thoughts. 4 comments 0 vote. Disturbing rumors. So, what are you going to do now? Albus Pharaohs asked when they finished the business, as the two of them had already been acquainted for some time. Going to rest for some time before returning to the Painted Mountains again, With the incoming overpopulation of the goblinoids, it is a good opportunity for the adventurers to make some money. Unfortunately for Valkorion, even though he was something that was generally called a transmigrator, he wasn't some kind of educated person in his past life. He was just an ordinary lawyer and professor of history of law and also had a doctorate in politology. If he was an engineer or something like that, he would be already dabbling in creating some things from his past life or so, but unfortunately enough, he didn't have enough practical or theoretical knowledge to do something like that. However, he was keeping an eye on some skilled people because he could provide something that was almost equally valuable: ideas. Understandable, though lately there have been rumors of some powerful Dothraki call united several Khalasars, and some say that they would be attacking either the Freehold or the Slavers' Bay en masse. Hearing what Albus said, Valkorion didn't really know what to think about it because it was weird. Dothraki were known as the scourge of Essos. Even though they were very primitive, they had numbers and were rather powerful warriors on their own. Not to mention, they had a rather large number of Beyonders, so even for the Valyrians, they needed to take them rather seriously if a powerful call emerged among them. Only due to the dragons, were they able to keep the Dothraki from attacking them every other day. Didn't they learn anything from the past already? As someone who was born and lived in the Freehold, Valkorion greatly looked down on the Horse Lords due to how primitive they were. Even though the Valyrians were not the most advanced civilization compared to the 21st century Earth, Dothraki were just plain barbarians. Ha! By the dragon gods, who knows what is going in their heads aside from riding across the plains. Still, they have become more bold, and from what I heard, they even started attacking caravans of the clan pharaohs. Now, that would be considered a serious problem because normally, Dothraki were not attacking the caravans that belonged to the prominent families in the Valyrian Freehold, be it that of the Dragonlord families, some Valyrian nobles or several of the most powerful mercantile clans. As someone who was rather skilled in understanding politics and how things worked, he understood that there was something that forced the Dothraki to change their habits, and that wasn't good news. They were cowards when it came to the Freehold, as they feared dragon fire more than anything else. You fearing that they would be able to bypass the Painted Mountains and attack the Careries directly. Careries wasn't far from the marine itself, so it wasn't really impossible for the Dothraki to bypass the Painted Mountains and attack the Careries directly. There is certainly that possibility. In the end, this city is one of the most prosperous fortress cities in the Freehold. I don't doubt that if they could plunder it, they would obtain sizable riches, especially when it came to the Beyonder side of things. Indeed, that was a thing that sacking cities such as Yunkai or Marine were severely lacking. If they sacked some of the cities in the Slavers' Bay, they would be able to obtain enormous amounts of gold and slaves, perhaps some sealed artifacts and some things, but that's all. If they sacked some cities like Careries, their gains would be much bigger. I don't think that the House Baleares would allow something like that. Valkorion voiced his thoughts and saw Albus Pharaohs agreeing with the sentiment. There was no way that the House Baleares would allow something to happen to the Careries. It was one of their most prized possession, so Valkorion didn't doubt that at first sight of trouble, there would station several dragon riders and powerful Beyonders to protect the city. Yeah, after they exchanged some small talk, and after that, Valkorion decided to return home. As he was walking him, he couldn't really shake off the bad feeling because, as someone who had meta-knowledge, he knew that such a big move as this was most probably an advancement ritual for the Dothraki call. And it wasn't as simple as that. Residential area of the Careries. Within the residential area of the Careries, there was a rather nice, medieval-looking villa behind huge walls. It wasn't overly big, but it wasn't very small. One could safely say that it was rather big for one person living there. In fact, it was one of the secret properties of the House Tenebranes, and it was also the place where the servants of his father brought him, when they espaced with him from the capital Valyria when he was still a babe. He was brought up by a few remaining loyal servants of the Tenebranes, but from them, one of them was one of the butlers who died a few years ago, and the rest were some soldiers, but they perished even before the butler died. They worked as adventurers and got killed in the Painted Mountains as they were not Beyonders or anything, just ordinary slave soldiers. Unfortunately for Valkorion, the one who brought him from Valyria to Careries, wasn't really a high-ranking servant of the Hosu Tenebranes, so they didn't bring with them almost any wealth. From there on, he was living in the house alone. On the bright side of things, as this was supposed to serve as one of the secret places for the members of the House Tenebranes, it was given top-notch protection and there were even a few defensive spells that were laid by saints of several Beander pathways. That was something that Valkorion learned from the old butler who was taking care of him until he died. It was basically a safe place. He didn't really need to fear that someone would break in or anything. Even then, such things were beyond rare in the Valyrian cities. He had to admit that real crime was very rare in the core Valyrian cities and fortress cities such as Careries. If this was his past world, one wouldn't be able to really stroll through the city during the night and act like nothing was happening. His house was rather cozy. For the past several years, he had been buying some pieces of furniture and so on, thus, the interior of the house looked rather nice. And because he was paranoid as fuck, he didn't have any servants in his house. He was thinking of buying some slaves, but he would need to buy those who were marked with Beyonders to make them absolutely loyal to their master. Valkorion wasn't betting on the mundane methods of training, but the slaves that had some spells placed on them to ensure their absolute loyalty were sometimes even 10 times pricier than those without. On Patreon, there are already 20+ chapters ahead of the current release rate. Support me on the Patreon for the future releases. URL. Trafford Creators Thoughts. 4 comments 0 vote. Feeling of power is great. The master bedroom was a luxurious, probably the most luxurious place within the entire mansion that was left by the House Tenebranes, with a massive, canopied bed draped in rich, velvety fabrics of deep reds, purples, and golds. The bedposts were carved with intricate patterns of vines and extraordinary and mythical creatures. Heavy curtains matching the bed's colors could be drawn across the tall, narrow windows to block out the light. A large fireplace, surrounded by comfortable chairs, provided warmth. A wardrobe, ornately carved from dark wood, stands against one wall, its doors inlaid with scenes of knights and dragons. The floor is covered with thick, plush rugs, and the walls are adorned with portraits of long-dead ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow you as you move about the room. When he arrived at the master bedroom, which was the place where he was keeping some of his valuables, he started putting them down to the chest. Right now, his current wealth was something around 1,500 golden dragon coins, which was rather a lot. Such a sum of money was considerable for even members of the Valyrian nobility, obviously not for the members of the Dragonlord families or some of the mercantile clans. Still, Valkorion was rather satisfied with the current progress. For someone at his level, this was rather a good start. He was already thinking that after obtaining the money from selling the armband made from the Imperial gold, he would invest in some slaves and perhaps create a small mercenary group. He wanted to create only a few of them. Perhaps it would be best thing would be to make some of them Beyonders if they proved themselves and were absolutely loyal. This would then allow him to gather more and more resources and money and to prepare for the inevitable doom of the Valyria. Though for now, he had enough money to buy a few slaves, perhaps a few with the absolute loyalty marks placed on them, which could be turned into the Beyonders, and then a whole bunch of the ordinary slaves that would act as the base of the mercenary organization. Slave marks for Beyonders were more tricky, because for the mark to work properly, one always needed to be stronger than the slave. For example, if someone wanted to enslave Sequence 7 Beyonder, he needed to be at least Sequence 6. Though from what Valkorion heard from some of the people that he knew who were selling slaves, it didn't work for the high sequence Beyonders, and depending on the pathway of the slave, even some mid-sequences would have some problems. Even though Valkorion was originally from a very advanced society where slavery in such a form didn't exist for several centuries because he had lived in this world for 17 years or so, he had already gotten used to it. Whatever, for now, I need to rest. After some time, I will return back to the Painted Mountains. Based on what Albus said, it is nigh impossible that the goblins obtained an imperial gold armband from some traveler. Nobody would be stupid enough to carry something that valuable through such a place, so the only logical conclusion is that they must have found it somewhere. Valkorion clearly remembered the location where he encountered the goblins, so he decided to return there and then started searching from that place forward. If he was lucky, then he would be able to find the place where the goblins obtained the pieces of jewelry and treasures. The most probable scenario was that the goblins found some grave or some treasure. In the next morning, he started the day exactly the same way, as the first thing that he was doing was training with the sword. Part of it was due to the acting method of the Sequence 7 warrior, and another reason was that he rather liked training in swordsmanship and martial arts. The feeling of getting stronger was rather intoxicating and very, very addicting. Especially for someone like him, who lived in a relatively peaceful world previously, where such things were rare and violence was looked down on. People were living in the delusions of human equality and other bullshit that were plaguing the society of man of 21st century Earth. The very moment he remembered it very well, it was something that he couldn't really forget for his entire life. And when he stepped into the extraordinary pathway of the Beander, that power he felt, the might, the felling, everything was so addicting. That was the moment he realized that he was addicted to the feeling of obtaining power of any kind, especially the real power belonging to a single individual who could destroy anything in front of him with his powers. One could destroy entire cities if they were angered. That was something that he always desired. Power to decide who would live and who would die, the power to decide what was wrong and what was good, the power to decide the fate itself. The blazing fire in his eyes couldn't be hidden, as his golden eyes glowed a little when he was training and felt the intoxicating feeling when he noticed that his sword stances were getting better and more refined under the visible eye. In the Valyria, Ashai, and Golden Empire of Yi, they were classified as mastery over some weapon or martial arts in several grades, depending on the mastery over the weapon or martial art. Valkorion learned that he was rather talented in this aspect because even before he became Beander, he was already a journeyman in the aspect of swordsmanship because he was very skilled in the way of the sword. After becoming a Beander of the warrior pathway, it didn't take him long to reach adept mastery over the swordsmanship, stepping into the realms of the really skilled swordsman. Most of the people when it came to fighting with weapons or martial arts, were ranging from the ranks of novice to journeyman. Novices were basically people who only started practicing, their movements were clumsy, and their styles were not really good. After them, there were apprentices, those were already people who mastered some basics and knew how to fight so embarrassingly. After them, there was the journeyman rank, which basically stood for anyone who had complete mastery over the basics of some weapon art or martial arts and started developing their very own style. The rank where he was now was normally titled adept, meaning that he already had some resemblance of his own fighting style that he had some skills in. Adepts were already powerful warrior in the aspect of mastery over their weapon or martial arts. He spent most of his free time training, fighting, and once again training. Valkorion didn't know how strong he was without his Beander powers, but he was sure that if there were no Beander powers, then in the aspect of swordsmanship, he wouldn't lose even against the descendants of the 40 Dragonlord families. On Patreon, there are already 30 chapters ahead of the current release rate. Support me on the Patreon for future releases. Once again, subscribe to my Patreon. Only thanks to the patrons will I be able to continue writing and publishing novels. I will be able to publish, you will get the advanced chapters. Win-win, laughing face. URL, Trafford Creators Thoughts. 5 comments 0 vote, familiar face. He was using every opportunity to train in swordsmanship, as it was speeding up the acting method for the warrior tremendously, and with the current tempo, he predicted that within a few months, it would be fully digested. Valkorion was aware that being in the Valyria was a prime opportunity to gather strength before the doom and destruction of the one of the few extraordinary civilizations in the known world. Aside from training, he also spent a lot of time studying because knowledge was power, and this was also a good opportunity to learn about how the world worked and how things were here. Learning for him was almost equally enjoyable, like training with the sword because, surprisingly, you're not, but this mansion that he practically inherited from the Tenebranes family was brimming with an enormous library. From there he was able to learn much about the state of the world, about the Beyonders, the history of the world, various Orthodox churches and secret organizations of Beyonders that existed within the world. For example, within Westeros, there were several Orthodox churches reigning, be it the Church of the Seven Gods that was prominent within the kingdoms of Reach, Riverlands and Vale, or the Church of the Storms that was prominent within the kingdom of Stormlands. Church of the Drowned God in the Iron Islands or Parthenon worshipped the old gods that ruled the kingdom of North and also had some influence within the Beyond the Wall. Aside from these, there was a bunch of secret organizations running here and there in the Westeros. Essos was more complicated because there were more faiths, and nobody could tell if the various cults were worshipping actual gods or just some extraordinarily powerful Beander or so. Nobody could tell as the number was too high. Either way, Valkorion then returned back to the library after he finished the training season in the Juyo sword style. The mansion's library was a quiet, solemn room filled with towering bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling, packed with ancient tomes and scrolls. Because this was one of the places that should have served as a sanctuary for the direct descendants of the Tenebranes family, the library was huge and packed with a lot of books and precious things. A large, ornately carved desk was stationed in the center, covered with parchment, quills, and an assortment of decorations. The air smelled of old parchment, leather, and a faint hint of incense. Rich, dark wood paneling covered the walls, and thick, embroidered rugs made from the best silk covered the floor, muffling footsteps. A few deep armchairs are scattered around, perfect for long, contemplative reading sessions by the fire. This was one of the places within the mansion where Valkorion was spending most of his time. If he was, to be honest, then it was placed where he was spending most of the time, because he was even often sleeping in this place if he fell asleep during the time when he was reading. Unfortunately for him, even though this place contained a tremendous amount of knowledge, there were not many pieces about the deeper secrets of the world of the Beyonders or anything like that. Such things were too precious to be put down in a place like this causally, so Valkorion predicted that they must have been locked in the main residence of the House Tenebranes within the capital Valyria. And that one was already robbed by other people. Still, he was rather content with what he had because even this was better than nothing, and he could obtain a decent education just by going through these books. To become an accomplished Beyonder, one didn't need only raw power but also the corresponding knowledge about the world and its deeper mysteries. Right now, he was in the library and searching for the mentions about the painted mountains within the library. Fortunately enough, he would be able to find something about the painted mountains that could help him locate the place where the goblins had found the armband made from imperial gold. Unfortunately, even after a few hours of searching, he didn't find much, aside from the mentions of some tomb located within the painted mountains, or rather it were the rumors of the tomb, but nothing concrete. That was already a good start. He was able to get the approximate location of it, and surprisingly or not, it wasn't that far from the place where he encountered the goblins. With that being found, he decided that he needed to return to the Painted Mountains as soon as possible to explore the thing. According to the books, there should be some treasures in there, hopefully it would be true and not just some baseless rumors. Next day, between Fortress City Careries and Painted Mountains. Immediately on the morning of the next day, Valkorion left for the Painted Mountains, and because the Careries were just a few kilometers away from one of the main entrances to the Painted Mountains, he was rather quick to arrive at the place. In one of the entrances that he was using right now to enter the damned mountain range, he noticed that this time, he wasn't probably hunting alone within this part of the Painted Mountains, because he found the corpses of several tens of goblins, each one of them was killed instantly with arrow to the head. Ash. Within the Careries, there were not that many of the powerful adventurers that would be dwelling in the Painted Mountains on a daily basis. There was only one adventurer in the Careries who was such a fearsome and skilled archer to be able to dispatch several goblins within a few moments with a bow. Ash, the Frost Archer, as they called her. He was rather acquainted with her because they were one of the few adventurers who were frequently going into the Painted Mountains. Another thing that they had in common was the fact that Ash wasn't Valyrian but a foreigner, and Valkorion was the only Valyrian from the half. After checking on the killed goblins, he continued deeper into the Painted Mountains for some time, until he encountered another group of killed goblins in exactly identical fashion like the previous ones. It wasn't long until he saw the familiar figure of Asha, who was standing several tens of meters away from him, around several tens of corpses of goblins that were lying on the earth, every single one of them being killed by a single arrow. She was a slender, pale-skinned woman with blue eyes and long white hair. As usual, she also wore light, elegant robes with a distinct palette of black, dark blue, and gold. In her right hand, she was holding an ornamental-looking bow, which was her main weapon. As he entered the area, she was able to notice him as she looked in his way, with her bow ready and arrow prepared to be fired when things devolved into a fight. When she realized that it was Valkorion, she relaxed a bit, but not immediately, as they were staring at each other for some time. "Are you following me, Nerona?" she asked skeptically with her usual stoic facade, not changing her stance as she continued staring at him because it was still possible that he was here to kill her for something. It wasn't really unheard of adventurers acting as assassins or something, especially for the more unscrupulous ones that were not close to taking assassination requests. Or for those who were just greedy for the possessions of the other adventurers. On Patreon, there are already 30 chapters ahead of the current release rate. Support me on the Patreon for future releases. Once again, subscribe to my Patreon. Only thanks to the patrons will I be able to continue writing and publishing novels. I will be able to publish, you will get the advanced chapters. Win-win, laughing face. URL, Trafford Creators Thoughts. 4 comments 0 vote, Ash the Frost Archer. You are thinking too much of yourself, Ash, or you are becoming increasingly paranoid in these past years adventuring in the Painted Mountains. Valkorion said as she then put down the bow and arrow she was aiming at him, a clear signal that there wouldn't be a fight between them. That was the last thing that he wanted because he knew that Ash was rather strong. Not only was she extremely skilled with the bow and arrow, but he knew that she was also a powerful Beander, probably in sequence 6 if he had to guess, but he wasn't aware of her pathway. These days are becoming dangerous, and lately, there has been an increased rate of disappeared adventurers in the Painted Mountains, not only due to the monsters dwelling in this place. He immediately knew what she was talking about because it seemed that there were some people fishing on the adventurers. It wasn't that much of a surprise because with the increasing activity of the monsters in the Painted Mountains when monsters were practically everywhere, some people wanted to take advantage of that. In the end, Beander characteristics were selling too well, and the potential belongings of some adventures were rather decent and tempting for many people. They often said that the thing one needed to be most cautious of when hunting for the monsters in such regions were not the extraordinary creatures themselves but rather the other adventurers, cultists, and other questionable individuals that were lurking in the shadows. It reminded Valkorion Chinese saying, mantis stalking cicada, unaware of Oriole behind. It was perfect to describe the regions like the Painted Mountains. So, how have you been? His attempts to start the conversation with the cold archer had been awkward, but Ash and Valkorion knew each other for some time already, so he knew that any talk with her was rather hard. She was a silent person, usually keeping to herself with a strong distrust of other people, which was logical. Valkorion wasn't stupid to trust adventurers because, in his view, they were people without much honor or loyalty. Still using this small talk, Ash looked at the Valkorion who was approaching her as she took out her dagger and started cutting out several parts from the killed goblins for their parts. Like Valkorion, she spent most of her time in the Painted Mountains, and among the adventurers of the Careries, she was the one with the highest kill rate. It's called having manners, Ash, but whatever, are you going deeper or remaining in the outskirts? Outskirts of the Painted Mountains was the area of the Painted Mountains where most of the weaker adventurers were usually going because only those ones who were Beyonders dared to enter the inner areas of the Painted Mountains to try their luck, but even for them, it could easily spell their doom. Deeper. She said just one word as Valkorion patiently waited until she finished her work on the goblins and put away several parts of the goblins into her backpack. Are you coming too? Ash then looked at Valkorion, who nodded in agreement. They already ventured several times into the inner area of the Painted Mountains together, because often it was dangerous to go alone to such a hazardous place. Searching for something concrete, Valkorion knew that Ash wouldn't go into the inner areas of the Painted Mountains if there was no need for such a thing. She was very smart, and when the rumors of the overpopulation of the goblinoids started circulating in the entire region of Careries, she was one of the few who stopped venturing into the inner areas. Even though she was strong, Ash was aware of her limits and knew that even the strongest could be put down with sheer numbers. Though that rule didn't apply to the most powerful Beyonders, for the low-sequence Beyonders and mid-sequence Beyonders, it stood out as a severe warning. Ingredient, deep in the mountains, we can go together to Green Peak, and from there, each of us will go a separate way. Hearing her words, Valkorion didn't have much problem with this as this was a good agreement. Green Peak was rather far from here, and from there, he would need to walk another few hours until he arrived at the place where the tomb he was searching for was supposedly lay. Then we have agreement. If he could, then he also wouldn't have ventured into this place alone because it carried too high risk, and he wasn't keen on dying once again. But he needed to advance to sequence 6 and gather more wealth for his plans. So, in the end, he needed to undertake the risks because the time was ticking. When Ash completed what she wanted, they started walking to their target, which was the Green Peak. One of the notable points in the Painted Mountains, because it was considered an entrance to the true inner regions of the Painted Mountains. It was swarming there with goblins and hobgoblins, thus the name of the Green Peak. Aside from that, Valkorion remembered that around 100 years ago, it was the place where one of the last goblin kings rallied his forces against the Valyria and attempted to raid the lands below. only to be slayed by the Valyrian Beyonders. His armies were turned to ash by the Valyrian dragons, which turned the entire region into a scorching inferno of flames, which was burning even several days after the battle. Painted Mountains, several hours later. Stop. They were walking for several hours strength, climbing some rocks and walking through narrow pathways between the mountains, when Ash stopped out of nowhere when she looked at the ground. What is it? He knew that she wouldn't stop without a reason. During that time, they were talking, but mostly about the monsters and extraordinary creatures of the Painted Mountains and their weaknesses. There are footsteps here, not of goblins, these are bigger and more robust. Judging by their size and shape, they should belong to the bugbears, several tens of whom are rather fresh. Bugbears resembled hairy, feral goblins standing around 2.1 meters tall. They took their name from their noses and claws, which were similar to those of bears. Their claws were often not long and sharp enough to be used as weapons, so bugbears usually armored and armed themselves with a variety of purloined gear, which was ordinarily second-rate and in poor repair. Still, they were excellent scavengers, and they often found really good pieces of weapons or armor if they were lucky. For the more powerful bugbears, they were even more dangerous than the ordinary ones, because their claws became much stronger and sharper, and in a moment of surprise, they could use them to stab their opponents. Not to mention, they were physically rather strong, far stronger than goblins, and they were also a bit smarter. Bugbears, like other goblinoids, had a reputation for being dim-witted and brutish. This claim was not unfounded, and like their kin, bugbears had easily provoked tempers and were prone to rages. When Bugbear entered the enraged state, he was several times stronger than usual, and they cared only for the death of their foes, not even caring about their very own well-being or state, often fighting to death even at the price of grievous injuries that they sustained or death itself. On Patreon, there are already 30 chapters ahead of the current release rate. Support me on the Patreon for future releases. Once again, subscribe to my Patreon. Only thanks to the patrons will I be able to continue writing and publishing novels. I will be able to publish, you will get the advanced chapters. Win-win, laughing face. URL, Trafford Creators Thoughts. 3 comments 0 vote, bugbears. So we have probably an entire group of bugbears somewhere around here, this could be problematic. Valkorion muttered because bugbears were not really his favorite type of enemy, as they were smarter and stronger than goblins, probably around the level of the hobgoblins. Especially when the bugbears were far more numerous and better armed than goblins and hobgoblins. Bugbears were more problematic to fight than goblins and even more than hobgoblins because they were more ferocious and brutal. They were also better armed than goblins, that was for sure, and their combat instincts were far superior to them as well. That was another thing that was making them even more dangerous, so Valkorion was typically worried about the bugbears, especially when they were in a large group. We need to deal with them. Taking a detour would take us several days to reach the Green Peak. Ash muttered as she finished studying the traces of the bugbear's feet on the ground because everything had completed itself right now. If they decided to take the detour, it would take them several days to reach the Green Peak. So, they were right now standing in front of a dilemma if they should take the detour or to continue and potentially fight a whole bunch of bugbears to death. Neither of the two possibilities sounded really pleasant for Valkorion, not to mention there was also the possibility of being attacked when they were taking a detour to reach the Green Peak. How many of them are there? Can you take a guess based on the footsteps? Valkorion looked at Ash, who nodded. She stood up, scrutinizing the area for further traces of the bugbears. Seeing this, Valkorion suspected that she could probably be on the Hunter pathway or Ranger pathway because he was acquainted with the Beyonders on these pathways and knew some of their general abilities. Though the sole thing that he was aware of were the names of the lowest sequenesses, so that was all. For sure, Ash was someone who was at Sequence 6, perhaps she was already preparing to advance to Sequence 5 and become mid-sequence Beyonder. Based on the aura she was giving him, he could tell that she was more powerful than he was. A perk of the Valyrian heritage of the Tenebranes family, as he inherited some sort of passive danger sense or whatever, which basically allowed him to tell when he was in danger or if his foe or any other person was more powerful than he was. It was an inherent ability that had saved his life several times already. Without it, he would be one of the countless unnamed corpses decaying somewhere in the Painted Mountains. Valkorion knew that when powerful Beyonder had children, they could pass some of their abilities down to their lineage. When it came to the Valyrians, especially to the Dragonlord families, it was even more powerful due to the bond that the Dragonlords had with their dragons, as they had some of the dragon blood in their veins. Due to that, descendants of the Dragonlord families were more powerful than the average people, even if they were not Beyonders. They may even exclude some particular traits, like resistance to fire, inherent ability to control fire, or very strong affinity for some Beyonder pathway. Unfortunately for the young mixed blood, he knew that this Tenebrane's lineage was dormant and wasn't awakened, or else he would have obtained something better than just passive danger sense, which, in his opinion, was actually a very overpowered ability, in fact. Something between 15 to 18. She immediately answered. For her to tell how many enemies there were based on the food sets was the easiest thing to do. That was a relatively high number of bugbears, but it was still manageable if there were 2 of them and if the bugbears were not particularly strong either. Valkorion knew that Sequence 7 and Sequence 6 extraordinary creatures were rare in these parts of the Painted Mountains, as most of them resided exclusively in the inner areas of the Painted Mokuantizan. The same could be said about the bugbears that reached Sequence 7 or Sequence 6. The chance that they would encounter one of those here was very small, practically speaking, it was nearing 0. Those are indeed manageable numbers, so how shall we do it? He asked Ash as they decided to fight against the bugbears. Valkorion knew that such a fight could speed up the acting method of digesting the warrior potion, and he could have obtained some loot from the bugbears. If it was a bigger group of the bugbears, then it was for sure that they would have some nice things in their possession. Follow after them and wait until they rest. With my sharpshooting, I can take the ones that would seem to be leaders of the group even before they realize that something is going on and get them to a manageable number, during which you will attack and keep them occupied, preferably killing some along the way. Valkorion didn't have much problem with Ash's proposition for the elimination of the bugbears because it was a good one. Their strongest card was their element of surprise, and Ash, being probably the best archer in the entire Careries, should be able to kill the leaders among the group of bugbears during the ambush. Afterward, he would attack the disorganized bugbears, and together, they would finish them off one by one. Thus, after coming to an agreement, they followed the footsteps of the bugbears until they arrived at something that looked like a small plateau in the mountains. It wasn't particularly large, but it was surrounded by huge rocks, making it very hard to bypass, and it was still large enough to provide accommodation to a few tens of people. Thus, it was logical for the bugbears to stop there as they were working on the crude tents or whatever they were using to sleep. Both Ash and Valkorion knew that they needed to have the perfect place to attack the bugbears, thus, they started searching for the position from which Ash could have a good view of the bugbears that were building their tents. It didn't take long for Ash to find the appropriate place, after which, Valkorion left there and went to the tight pathway that served as one of the entrances to the small plateau where the bugbears were building their tents or whatever. Meanwhile, Valkorion was going there, with his hand on the handle of the sword. Ash was scrutinizing the bugbears as she was searching for the ones that she suspected to be one of the commanding bugbears. Bugbears, like the rest of the goblinoids, were very primitive, especially in the aspect of their society and how they did things. Essentially, the stronger the individual was, the more authority one would have. This authority would typically come with the military power over the members of the tribe. Bugbears that were in charge of the other bugbears were rather easily distinguishable because they typically had more weapons, better weapons, and a complete set of armor. Not to mention, they were also typically bigger and stronger. Soon enough, Ash found 3 bugbears that were sold in far better armors than the rest of the group, not to mention one of them had even a complete set of armor covering his whole body. She readied her bow and prepared the bluish arrow for what was to come. On Patreon, there are already 30 chapters ahead of the current release rate. Support me on the Patreon for future releases. Once again, subscribe to my Patreon. Only thanks to the patrons will I be able to continue writing and publishing novels. I will be able to publish, you will get the advanced chapters. Win-win, laughing face. URL. Trafford creators' thoughts. 4 comments 0 vote. Bloodshed. Meanwhile, Ash was preparing for the assassinations of the bugbears, and Valkorion was waiting for the opportunity to strike down below, on one of the paths that were leading to the plateau where the bugbears were constructing their tents and accommodations. As he looked at himself, he seriously contemplated buying some new armor and a sword because even though his leather armor was made from the skin of extraordinary creature, namely from the hide of Sequence 7 Violet Mountain Bear, it wasn't as powerful as it seemed. And his sword was even in the worst condition. Preferably, he wanted to buy both armor and sword made from Valyrian steel, but even though this was the Valyrian Freehold, one couldn't just buy Valyrian steel out of nowhere. The council put a ban on selling Valyrian steel freely, be it weapons, arms, other objects, or even ordinary Valyrian steel ingots. It was rather hard to buy it, even though Valkorion knew that he could most probably afford it, as the Valyrian steel wasn't actually that pricey. Prices were running in the thousands for the swords, depending on the size, though the most important factor was the blacksmith who was making the weapon. If it was a weapon made by a powerful Beander blacksmith and made with the flames of older and more powerful dragons, then the price would be even in the tens of thousands. Still, the most problematic thing when it came to buying anything made from the Valyrian steel, especially weapons and armors, was to have permission to buy such thing. Lords freeholders that were creating together the High Council of the Freehold were forbidding selling the Valyrian steel outside of the Dragonlord families, aristocratic families, freehold legions, and some other exceptions such as the Church of the Dragon God or some other Beander organizations. That was because Valyrian steel was a very powerful material, and weapons made from Valyrian steel could be countered only by some other Valyrian steel weapons or weapons made from different extraordinary materials. Valkorion obviously couldn't buy such a thing freely because he couldn't even use the name of the Tenebranes family. That would be rather foolish to risk his life for a weapon, so he could only wait for the opportunity. Right now, his best bet would be to find something in the Painted Mountains or through the connections of the clan pharaohs. Still, if this continues, I would need to look for a new weapon. From what I heard, mid-sequence Beyonders couldn't use normal weapons anymore, as their power would destroy them at a very fast rate. He pondered over the matter as he then saw a bullish-looking arrow fly through the air, directly aiming at the plateau where the bugbears were camped, which was his signal for the actions. Several seconds later, he heard roars from the camp of the bugbears, when several of their members were killed by ash. Immediately afterward, Valkorion gripped his sword and rushed towards the bugbears, who were right now in a state of panic as their leaders were killed by assassination. For a few moments, they tried to find the shooter of the arrows, though, unfortunately for them, they couldn't pinpoint the location of the archer. Thus, the sole thing that they could do was to leave the plateau so they wouldn't be so vulnerable. The physical strength of the bugbear was something that wasn't to be underestimated as he approached the encampment of the bugbears with a sword in his hand. As the digestion of the warrior potion was speeding up, his physical strength was also being increased, and now, he knew that he could leave around 800 kilograms. According to his calculations, his physical strength would hit the limit when the potion was completely digested, around 1 ton, which was a tremendous amount. That won't be less than many extraordinary creatures living in the Painted Mountains. Fortunately for him right now, even though his sword wasn't made from any extraordinary material, due to the superior smithing methods of the Valyrian Freehold, it was still capable of serving him well, even though the situation wasn't ideal. Just a few seconds was everything that was needed until he arrived at the end of the narrow pathway and appeared on the plateau, which was completely covered by the bugbears' shabby tents and other things as they were building here. He also saw the bugbears that were panicking right now because another one of them went down, lowering their overall number to approximately 12 or so. It was rather hard to tell because it was possible that some of them were hiding in their tents and preparing to ambush the invaders. In the end, bugbears could be pretty cunning if they wished. Valkorion readied his sword and looked at the nearest bugbear. The goblinoid noticed him as well and raised the enormous cub that he was wielding. He rushed at the human wielding a sword and observed the goblinoids. He just stood there, unmoving and observing the bugbear that was rushing at him, scoffing internally seeing his shabby movements, as Valkorion just moves to the right and with a single swing of his sword, he slit the throat of the bugbear. Too aggressive, or maybe scared from the assassin in the form of Ash, overall rather disappointed, but corresponding to the common style of the goblinoids. Bugbears or hobgoblins were not particularly skilled in the area of combat, and they rather relied on their physical superiority, brute strength, or sometimes in combination with numbers to crush their foes. It was their most common strategy and the first thing that they would do during the fight. That was also the reason why most of the bugbears were carrying those unreasonable large weapons that they could not even properly use. In the end, it corresponded to their physical strength, and with the cub, they could squash their enemies like a bug. When Valkorion saw the cub that the recently deceased bugbear was holding, he knew that even many low-sequence Beyonders would not be able to effectively wield such a weapon. Immediately, there were 3 other bugbears rushing at Valkorion when they noticed an invader in their encampment. All of them were wearing ramshackled armors and armed with oversized weapons that were rather impractical for real combat. Most of their weapons were rusty and in heavy need of maintenance, or they just dropped them to the furnace and smelt them into something new because they looked ripe for the garbage bin. Valkorion immediately got into the combat stance of the Juyo, the first stance, and in a flash, appeared in front of the 3 bugbears that immediately swung their weapons towards him, as he dodged and flipped beneath one of them as he stabbed his sword into the stomach of one of them. 1 down, 2 to go, he muttered, turning his attention to the other 2 bugbears, who immediately attacked Valkorion when they noticed that one of their compatriots was killed. Meanwhile, Valkorion attacked the bugbears and attracted their attention. Ash killed another one of the bugbears who attempted to take command of the other bugbears. That would certainly complicate the matters for Valkorion, who was fighting the bugbears at their camp. On Patreon, there are already 30 chapters ahead of the current release rate. Support me on the Patreon for future releases. Once again, subscribe to my Patreon. Only thanks to the patrons will I be able to continue writing and publishing novels. I will be able to publish, you will get the advanced chapters. Win-win, laughing face. URL. Trafford Creautres thoughts. 3 comments 0 vote, single combat. When he was using the Juyo sword stances, it was rather easy to deal with the bugbears because they were not really particularly skilled in any weapon. They were terrible fighters, truth to be told, and could barely hold their own against him when they were fighting him one-on-one. Even when he was surrounded by several bugbears, Valkorion didn't really have problems dealing with them. He danced around the bugbears with grace and speed, attacking with deadly precision as he swung his blade and severed the head of one of the bugbears that wasn't paying attention for a brief moment. That was all that he needed to kill his enemies. When he disposed of the 2 bugbears and turned them into cold corpses laying on the earth, staining the colors of the place with their blood that was flowing from the severed head of one and the slitted throat of another. When he disposed of the 2 bugbears, he entered the core of the encampment, where the remaining bugbears were panicking because most of them were being killed easily under the arrows of Ash. She indeed proved that she was a fearsome sharpshooter as she was killing one bugbear after another. Which made Valkorion grin because he needed to speed up. Obviously, he couldn't lose against the Ash when it came to the kill rate. Seeing that Ash was leading, he rushed to the nearest of the bugbears that was in the tent as he still marveled at the superhuman speed that he got from becoming Sequence 7 warrior Beander. He ran faster than any of the bugbears, and because the goblinoids were as clumsy as they were stupid, it was rather easy to dodge their rather uncoordinated attacks. Valkorion was trained in the art of war, fighting, and swordsmanship from a very young age. That was still when the mansion where he was living wasn't empty with just him. Training with the former legionaries of the Valyrian Legion taught him a lot, and he amassed the standard training of the lockstep legions and even that of the elite legions like Unsullied. One could say that he was a very elite and effective combatant who focused on efficiency above everything else. It was also the reason why he held particular distaste for the Knights of Westeros or Andalos. When he saw them fighting, he was rather disappointed. Most of their movements were just for show and many of them didn't even fight to kill, but fought just to fight. Rather foolish, in his opinion, if someone could deliver a fatal blow and chose not for whatever reasons. Not to mention, most of them lived in some delusion of chivalry that in fights, there were rules that cost many of them their very own lives. Especially here in the Essos, where there is only a single rule. Kill or be killed. Many of the Westerosi Kangits would end in the Essos, mostly because their lords lost in war, lost their titles or went bankrupt. Or perhaps even the knights themselves went bankrupt or whatever reasons brought them to Westeros. Still, Valkorion also had some who were dangerous killers and were not like the rest of the Summer Knights, as Essosi or those north of the Westeros called mockingly. Those knights, especially those who were Beyonders, were highly sought by the Dragonlord families as retainers and bodyguards. Ruar. Just as he was about to deliver the finishing blow to one of the bugbears that was kicked on the ground by him, he heard a loud roar that clearly belonged to the bugbear. However, it was more powerful than the ordinary roar as it had most probably some spiritual properties because it felt a little weird. Still, the roar didn't have much effect on his person, but on the other bugbears, it had, as all of them suddenly stopped running, hiding, or trying to surround Valkorion and just stood there, looking in the direction of the roar. When Valkorion looked there, he saw there a bugbear. But this one was vastly different from the rest of his breed. It was much larger than other bugbears, towering over Valkorion with a height of around 3.5 meters. It looked much stronger, judging by the bubbling muscles. The bugbear also had longer claws that were sharp as steel, and sharp teeth could be seen from his mouth. It was clear that this was Sequence 7 extraordinary creature. Even Ash would have problems killing it with her archery because the bugbear was unnaturally strong, and she lacked direct offensive power. When the bugbears advanced to Sequence 7, they became bigger, much stronger, more powerful and durable, and even had a certain degree of regeneration. Overall, they were much harder to deal with. Not only Sequence 7, but also Mutated 1. Dragon gods above, the extraordinary core of this thing would be priceless if it also possesses the characteristic of the mutation. I would strike the killing with this. Valkorion thought as he raised his hand and signaled towards the enormous bugbear, who was clad in steel armor, holding a huge steel cub, and also armed with an enormous shield that was bigger than his entire person. It seems that someone is very well prepared for a fight. The signal that he made was for Ash, that he wanted to take the bugbear for by himself, as the remaining ones were running towards the source of the arrows that were killing their compatriots. Valkorion stabbed his sword into the heart of the goblinoid that was crawling under his feet for his very own life, as he then turned his undivided attention to the bugbear in front of him. Valyrian, human weak, kill you, feast flesh. He was rather surprised hearing the high Valyrian from the mouth of the bugbear. It was rather common knowledge that the goblinoids didn't speak any other languages than their native ones, as they were not bright enough to learn one. This was rather a bad omen because it seemed that this bugbear was smart enough to learn the basics of the high Valyrian. Even though it seemed to be broken as an old toy, it was still a sign for him not to underestimate the intelligence of his opponent. One of the reasons why the Valyrian Freehold had a rather easy time dealing with the goblinoids of the Painted Mountains was that they were not the smartest ones around, and due to that, it was easier to defeat them. As Valkorion observed the hulking bugbear, his heart started beating faster and faster in anticipation of a good fight because he would finally have the opportunity to go all out and use all of his abilities in signal combat against a worthy foe. This was rather a rare occasion, especially when the rewards from the fight seemed so much appealing. He was confident in Ash handling the rest of the bugbears because he took 5 of them alone after he entered the camp, and the rest would be entering her territory that was seeded with traps and ambushes. He already saw several arrows that were heading for 2 bugbears. Ash indeed worked really fast because the moment she realized that the bugbears were coming for her, she immediately fired 2 arrows in short succession that claimed the lives of 2 bugbears as they pierced their skulls with 0 resistance. On Patreon, there are already 30 chapters ahead of the current release rate. Support me on the Patreon for future releases. Once again, subscribe to my Patreon. Only thanks to the patrons will I be able to continue writing and publishing novels. I will be able to publish, you will get the advanced chapters. Win-win, laughing face. URL. Trafford Creators Thoughts.